My beloved child, something changed today, and the person connected to your heart did not expect to be the one who discovered it. It began quietly, without confrontation, without a dramatic scene, without anyone realizing that one small detail was about to make several confusing moments finally connect. Your soulmate had been going through an ordinary part of their day when something caught their attention. It was not the loudest thing in the room. It was not even something they were looking for. But once they noticed it, they could not simply forget it. A message. A familiar name. A detail that appeared where it should not have appeared. For a few seconds, they stared at it, trying to convince themselves that there had to be another explanation. And perhaps that is what makes this moment so important. They did not immediately assume the worst. They slowed down. They looked again. They remembered something the third party had said earlier, something that seemed harmless at the time, and suddenly the words carried a completely different meaning. Their first thought was not anger. Their first thought was you. They wondered whether you already knew. They wondered whether you had noticed the same strange distance, the same confusing shift, the same little interruptions that had appeared between two people who once seemed capable of understanding each other without needing many words. And then a sentence formed inside them so clearly that they could not ignore it: I have to warn you before it's too late. Not because they believe something terrible is coming, but because they have realized that you deserve to understand what has been happening around the connection instead of questioning yourself for things you may never have caused. The unusual part is that your soulmate had defended this third party more than once. They had dismissed little comments. They had overlooked strangely timed interruptions. They had told themselves that perhaps they were imagining the pattern. But today, one piece of information made them reconsider those assumptions. Something had been repeated incorrectly. A private detail had reached someone who should not have known it. A conversation had apparently been described differently depending on who was listening. And when your soulmate quietly compared what they remembered with what they had just discovered, one realization settled over them. Someone may have been shaping the story between you without either of you seeing the full picture. Don't skip, because the most meaningful part is not what the third party may have done. It is what your soulmate chose to do after realizing it. They did not immediately confront anyone. They did not create chaos. They became unusually quiet. They stepped away from the noise and started remembering moments they had previously blamed on timing, misunderstanding, or emotional distance. That message they almost sent you but somehow talked themselves out of sending. That day when they heard something about you and reacted without asking you directly. That strange period when they felt you pulling away, even though neither of you had clearly chosen to leave. One memory after another returned, and with each one, the same question grew stronger: what if some of the distance between you was never truly created by either of you? Then came the detail that made them put their phone down. Your soulmate remembered something you once said, perhaps casually, perhaps during a moment when you were trying to explain yourself, and for the first time, they heard those words without everyone else's opinion surrounding them. They remembered the sincerity in your tone. They remembered how you had tried to make something clear without forcing them to believe you. And now, standing on the other side of today's discovery, they began to understand why you may have seemed tired, guarded, or unwilling to keep explaining yourself. You were not asking them to choose sides. You may simply have wanted them to trust what they knew about you more than what other people were suggesting. That realization landed differently. Your soulmate did not suddenly believe every assumption they had ever made was wrong. This was something quieter and more mature. They realized they should have asked you more questions. They should have listened more carefully. They should have protected the space between you from unnecessary interpretations. And somewhere in that reflection, their urge to reach you became stronger. Not with a dramatic confession. Not with accusations. With truth. A few minutes later, something almost happened. Your soulmate opened your conversation. Their fingers moved toward the screen. They typed several words, stopped, erased them, and tried again. The message was too important to send carelessly because they knew that if they reached you now, they did not want to bring another confusing story into your life. They wanted to bring clarity. Stay till the end, because what they almost wrote reveals where their heart is moving. The first version began with an explanation. They deleted it. The second began with the third party's name. They deleted that too. Then they sat there looking at the empty message box until they understood something. This was not really about the third party anymore. It was about whether they were finally willing to communicate with you directly. Whether they could stop allowing other voices to occupy the space where honesty should have existed. And so the next sentence they typed was much simpler. There's something I found out today, and I think you deserve to hear it from me. They read it twice. Their heartbeat shifted. They still did not send it. Here is where the story becomes more personal than it first appears. Your soulmate's hesitation was not caused by a lack of feeling. It came from realizing that once they tell you what they discovered, they may also have to admit something about themselves. They may have to acknowledge that outside opinions influenced them more than they wanted to admit. They may have to explain why they became distant at certain moments. They may have to answer the question they have quietly avoided: if the connection mattered this much, why didn't they come directly to you sooner? That question stayed with them. Yet instead of running from it, they remained there, looking at your name, letting themselves feel the weight of what honesty might require. Something important is waiting for you, because today's discovery did not simply expose someone else's behavior. It exposed the weakness in the way communication between you had been handled. And your soulmate knows that fixing that cannot begin with blaming another person. It has to begin with courage. What happened next was almost invisible from the outside. Your soulmate went back through a few old exchanges, not obsessively, not searching for proof of a fantasy, but trying to remember your connection without the commentary that had surrounded it. One message made them stop. It was something simple you had said long ago. Perhaps you told them you never wanted to pressure them. Perhaps you said that if they ever wanted the truth, they could ask you directly. Perhaps you simply wished them well during a moment when you had every reason to be disappointed. Whatever those words were, they suddenly carried new weight today. Your soulmate realized that while others had been telling them how to interpret you, you had often been giving them room to make their own decision. That difference became impossible to ignore. One person was trying to influence how they saw the connection. You were allowing them to see for themselves. And that is when their perspective began shifting in a way the third party probably never expected. Still, there is another layer. The thing your soulmate discovered today was not necessarily one enormous betrayal. In many ways, it was more believable than that and perhaps more revealing. It was a collection of small interferences. A suggestion made at exactly the wrong time. A story slightly altered. A comment framed as concern. A private feeling repeated outside the conversation. An assumption presented as certainty. None of these things alone would have seemed powerful enough to change anything. Together, however, they had created fog. Your soulmate could finally see that fog for what it was. And once someone recognizes the difference between their own feelings and someone else's interpretation of those feelings, something changes. They start thinking for themselves again. That is what happened today. Your soulmate began separating what they actually experienced with you from what they were told about you. And the difference surprised them. There was one particular memory they could not shake. A moment when they had almost reached out to you, only for the third party to say something that made them hesitate. At the time, it sounded reasonable. Maybe give them space. Maybe they don't feel the same. Maybe you should stop opening that door. Nothing harsh. Nothing obviously manipulative. Just enough uncertainty to make someone already afraid of rejection retreat into silence. Today your soulmate learned something that made that advice look very different. The third party may have known more about your feelings than they admitted. Perhaps they had seen something. Perhaps they had heard something. Perhaps they simply understood that the connection was stronger than they wanted it to become. Your soulmate is still piecing that together, and this is why they are not rushing toward you with half-finished conclusions. They want to speak when they can speak clearly. And then, unexpectedly, the emotional center of the entire day shifted. Your soulmate stopped thinking, "What did this person do?" and started thinking, "What do I want to do now?" That question changed everything. Because the third party can influence conversations, but they cannot choose what happens next. They cannot decide whether your soulmate reaches out. They cannot decide whether you listen. They cannot decide whether two people finally have the honest conversation they should have had from the beginning. Your soulmate understood this while standing in an ordinary moment, surrounded by an ordinary day, holding a truth that suddenly felt anything but ordinary. They realized that protecting your connection does not mean fighting everyone around it. Sometimes it simply means refusing to let anyone else speak for you. Their unfinished message is still there in some form, perhaps written, perhaps only rehearsed inside their mind, but the words have changed. The warning they want to give you is no longer, "Watch out for this person." It is more thoughtful than that. They want to tell you not to misunderstand their silence. They want to explain that something reached them today that made them question what they had previously accepted. They want you to know that if you felt confused by their behavior, there may have been reasons you were never shown. And most importantly, they want to ask you something directly rather than relying on another person's version of the answer. But just as your soulmate was preparing themselves to make that move, one final detail surfaced, something connected to a conversation the third party thought your soulmate would never hear about. It did not create panic. It created certainty. Your soulmate went completely still, read the words again, and suddenly understood why the third party had been so interested in keeping the two of you from having one specific conversation. Because if that conversation happens, there is one question your soulmate intends to ask you personally, and your answer could change the meaning of everything they thought they knew. The strange thing is, the question your soulmate wants to ask you is not the question anyone around them expected. It is not, "Why did you leave?" It is not, "Why didn't you fight harder?" And it is not even, "Do you still care?" Those questions crossed their mind, but something deeper replaced them. After seeing what surfaced today, they began wondering whether you had been trying to protect the connection in ways they never recognized. Whether some of your silence was restraint rather than indifference. Whether some of the moments they interpreted as distance were actually moments when you were refusing to compete with confusion. And now there is one sentence circling inside their mind with unusual persistence. What were you trying to tell me that I wasn't ready to hear? That question has changed the entire emotional direction of this day, because for the first time, your soulmate is not trying to explain you through somebody else's version of events. They are trying to understand you from your own point of view. Something even more revealing happened when they looked again at the conversation the third party never expected them to discover. There was no explosive confession hidden inside it. Nothing exaggerated. Nothing that would make a reasonable person instantly choose sides. Instead, there was something subtler. The third party had apparently known that your soulmate was considering contacting you. They knew there was still unfinished emotion. They knew your soulmate had questions. And rather than encouraging a direct conversation, they kept redirecting the subject. At first, your soulmate did not see anything unusual in that. Friends give opinions. People offer advice. Sometimes those opinions are even well-intended. But today they noticed the pattern. Whenever your name came up with warmth, the conversation was moved toward doubt. Whenever your soulmate remembered something good, another interpretation was introduced. Whenever there was an opportunity for direct clarity, there seemed to be a reason to postpone it. That repetition is what finally made your soulmate stop and think. Why was someone else so invested in an answer that only you could really give? For several quiet minutes, your soulmate did nothing at all. And that stillness mattered. They did not call anyone. They did not defend themselves. They did not start rewriting the past in extremes. They simply sat with the possibility that they had allowed too many voices into something deeply personal. That realization is uncomfortable because it asks for responsibility, not blame. Your soulmate understands that nobody forced them to believe anything. They made choices too. They hesitated. They withdrew. They let uncertainty grow. But acknowledging that did not make them feel defeated. Strangely, it made them feel more capable. Because if part of the distance came from choices, then new choices can create a different direction. Don't skip, because this is where today's discovery stopped being about interference and started becoming about intention. A memory returned with almost cinematic clarity. Your soulmate remembered one evening when they were close to reaching out. They had your conversation open. They had typed something simple, nothing dramatic, just enough to reopen communication. Then the third party contacted them. The timing seemed random back then. A few casual words were exchanged. Your name came up. And somehow, by the end of that conversation, your soulmate no longer felt brave enough to send what they had written. They told themselves they were being sensible. They told themselves they were avoiding embarrassment. But today, when they remembered that evening alongside what they had just discovered, they saw it differently. The hesitation had not originated entirely inside them. Someone had helped strengthen it. That does not mean every concern was false. It means the decision was never made in a completely clear emotional space. Then came another realization they did not expect: they had missed you most strongly after listening to other people tell them to move on. That contradiction stayed with them. If the connection had truly become meaningless, why did every attempt to dismiss it seem to make it louder inside them? Why did certain songs still make them remember your voice? Why did ordinary details, a phrase, a place, a familiar kind of humor bring back something they thought they had already put away? They had tried to interpret those moments as nostalgia. Perhaps some of them were. But today they wondered whether nostalgia was only part of the story. Maybe what kept returning was unfinished honesty. Not a promise that everything must work out, not some perfect destiny written beyond human choice, but a simple truth: there were things between you that had never been spoken clearly enough to be understood. Your soulmate picked up their phone again. This time they did not immediately open your messages. They opened their notes. It was a small decision, but it revealed how seriously they were taking the next step. They began writing down what they actually knew, separating facts from assumptions. What had you personally said? What had someone else claimed you meant? What had your soulmate directly witnessed? What had they merely been told? Slowly, those categories began separating. And the more they separated, the more one uncomfortable truth appeared. Some of the strongest conclusions your soulmate had formed about you were based on things you never said to them directly. Stay till the end, because one of those conclusions was connected to the very reason your soulmate stopped moving toward you in the first place. They had believed you wanted distance. Not because you clearly said, "I don't want you in my life," but because a series of small signals had been interpreted that way. A delayed response. A quieter tone. A moment when you chose not to explain yourself again. A third party suggesting that your behavior meant you had already emotionally moved on. Your soulmate accepted that interpretation because it protected them from the possibility of rejection. It was easier to believe you had closed the door than to walk toward it and discover the truth personally. But today they found out the third party may have known that your silence had a completely different context. Perhaps you were giving space because you thought your soulmate needed it. Perhaps you had grown tired of misunderstandings. Perhaps you felt that reaching harder would only make things more complicated. Whatever the exact reason, the third party had enough information to know that the situation was not as simple as they presented it. And that is what disturbed your soulmate, not because they suddenly believe every problem came from outside, but because someone they trusted had reduced a complicated emotional situation into a convenient story. The next moment was surprisingly tender. Your soulmate smiled at something you once said. They had been serious for most of the day, but one old message broke through that seriousness. It reminded them of the version of the connection that existed before everyone began analyzing it. Before every silence needed an explanation. Before every delay became evidence. Before both of you became careful. There was a time when talking to you felt easy. Natural. Even the disagreements carried a strange honesty because neither of you was trying to perform for anyone else. Your soulmate realized they missed that simplicity more than they had admitted. And that is why the warning they want to give you has changed again. At first, they thought they needed to tell you about the third party immediately. Now they understand there is something more important to say first. They need to tell you that they finally see how easily two people can lose each other when they communicate through assumptions instead of directly. They want to warn you not to interpret their past silence as the final truth of what they felt. They want you to know there were moments they almost spoke, moments they almost chose differently, moments when they cared far more than their behavior showed. Something important is waiting for you, because your soulmate has now made one quiet promise to themselves: if they reach out, they will not begin with blame. They will not drag you into a conflict with the third party. They will not ask you to defend yourself against every story they heard. Instead, they want to create one honest conversation where nobody else gets to define what either of you means. And then their phone lit up. For 1 second, your soulmate thought it was you. That tiny reaction told them more than they wanted to admit. Their attention sharpened instantly. Their heart lifted before their mind caught up. But the notification was not from you. It was from the third party. The message itself appeared normal, almost too normal. A casual question. A familiar tone. Nothing obviously connected to what your soulmate had uncovered. Yet this time, your soulmate read it differently. They noticed how quickly the message arrived after the earlier conversation had come to light. They noticed a question about what they were doing. They noticed another sentence that subtly brought your name into the conversation without directly mentioning you. It was almost as though the third party was checking the emotional temperature of the situation. Your soulmate did not answer immediately. That was new. Previously, they might have explained themselves. They might have reassured the person. They might have allowed the conversation to drift into another discussion about you. Today they simply looked at the screen and thought, "Why do I need permission to understand my own feelings?" That question landed with unexpected strength. For so long, your soulmate had been trying to avoid making the wrong move that they accidentally stopped making their own moves altogether. They listened to advice, watched reactions, studied timing, waited for certainty, and tried to protect everyone from discomfort. But relationships do not become clear through endless observation. At some point, somebody has to speak honestly. So your soulmate closed the third party's message. Then they opened yours. The unfinished sentence was still there. "There's something I found out today, and I think you deserve to hear it from me." Their finger hovered above the screen again. But instead of sending it, they added another line. "I also think I owe you a question." They stopped. Read it. Deleted the word "oh." Typed again. "There's something I need to ask you directly." That felt different. Cleaner. No guilt. No dramatic undertone. Just honesty. Yet they still hesitated, because your soulmate knows that direct communication carries a risk nobody can completely remove. You might answer differently from what they hope. You might need time. You might have your own questions. You might not be ready to reopen anything. And strangely, accepting those possibilities made them more certain that reaching out would still matter. Because their goal is shifting from controlling the outcome to understanding the truth. That is growth they did not have a few weeks ago. There was another moment today that almost nobody would notice from the outside. Your soulmate caught themselves imagining not a dramatic reunion, but a very ordinary conversation with you. Sitting somewhere quiet. No audience. No third party. No pressure. Just two people finally saying, "This is what I thought. What did you think?" That simple image affected them more deeply than any fantasy of everything instantly becoming perfect. Because what they want now is not intensity without understanding. They want clarity that can actually hold something real. Then a small detail from the newly uncovered conversation resurfaced in their mind. It was one sentence the third party had written. Your soulmate had skimmed over it the first time. Now they went back. The sentence suggested that the third party had spoken to someone else about you. Someone your soulmate had not realized was involved at all. That changed the picture. Not because another enemy had appeared. Nothing that dramatic. But because your soulmate suddenly understood that the story about your connection may have traveled farther than either of you knew. Different people may have heard different versions. Opinions may have formed around fragments. And your soulmate felt an immediate resistance to that. They thought, this should never have become everyone else's story. That may be the most important realization of the entire day. Your connection became crowded. Too many interpretations. Too many opinions. Too many imagined motives. And now your soulmate wants to make it smaller again. Just you. Just them. Just what was actually said, actually felt, actually chosen. The thought brought a kind of calm they had not felt in a long time. But the story was not finished. Later, your soulmate received one more piece of information, this time from someone who did not even know what had been discovered earlier. It came casually, almost accidentally, during an unrelated exchange. A person mentioned something the third party had said about you several days ago. Your soulmate froze. Not because the comment was cruel. Because it contradicted what the third party had told them privately. In one conversation, the third party had claimed you had completely moved on. In another, they apparently described you as someone who still cared deeply but was better left alone. Those two versions could not comfortably exist together. Why tell your soulmate you no longer cared, while telling someone else that you cared but should not be approached? That was the moment uncertainty became a clear question. Your soulmate did not need to decide the third party's motives. They did not need to label anyone. They simply understood that they could no longer treat second-hand information as reliable enough to guide something this personal. And suddenly, the message to you became less frightening. Because the worst outcome was no longer hearing a truth they might not like. The worst outcome was never asking. Your soulmate returned to your conversation one more time. This time, they did not delete the message. They added one final sentence. I should have asked you this myself a long time ago. Then they stared at those words. And somewhere in that silence, another memory surfaced, one so specific that it changed the question they were about to ask you entirely. Your soulmate remembered the last real conversation the two of you had before everything became complicated. They remembered something you said near the end, something they misunderstood at the time. Today, for the first time, they understood what you may actually have meant. And now they are no longer preparing to ask whether you ever cared. They are preparing to ask whether you were waiting for them to realize something they should have seen all along. The realization came back to your soulmate with such clarity that they had to stop what they were doing. That final conversation between you had seemed ordinary at the time, almost too ordinary to carry the weight it now held. You had said something that sounded like acceptance, something your soulmate interpreted as you stepping away, but today they remembered the way you said it, the pause before the words, the softness beneath them, the way you seemed to leave space for them to choose what happened next. And suddenly they wondered whether you had not been closing the door at all. Maybe you had simply stopped being the only person holding it open. That difference changed the entire memory. Your soulmate had spent so long believing that your quietness meant you had stopped caring that they never considered another possibility. Perhaps you cared enough to stop chasing clarity from someone who was not yet ready to give it. Perhaps you were waiting not necessarily for a grand return, not for some impossible promise, but for one honest moment where they finally came to you without another person's interpretation standing between you. That thought did something unexpected. It softened them. The defensiveness they had carried around the past began to loosen, and in its place came a quieter question: did I mistake their self-respect for distance? They did not have the answer yet. But for once, they were willing to ask instead of assume. Don't skip, because what happened next gave them another reason to reconsider everything. Your soulmate went back through several moments they had once labeled as proof that the connection was fading, and one by one, the certainty around those memories began to disappear. There was the time you answered briefly after they had been distant for days. Back then, they saw your short reply as coldness. Today they wondered whether you were simply matching the energy you had been receiving. There was the moment you stopped explaining yourself after a misunderstanding. They thought you had become indifferent. Now they could see how exhausting it must have been to keep defending your intentions against conclusions you had never created. There was the day you seemed calm while they expected you to fight harder for the connection. They had taken your calmness as a lack of emotion. But perhaps it was something else entirely. Perhaps you had reached the point where you understood that real connection cannot be forced through endless proving. These were not convenient excuses. Your soulmate was not trying to rewrite every mistake into a beautiful story. They were simply allowing themselves to see that there may have been more than one interpretation all along. And that realization made the third party's influence feel even more significant, not because the third party controlled everything, but because they consistently encouraged the interpretation that created the most distance. A hesitation became rejection. A boundary became indifference. A quiet moment became evidence that you had moved on. Each conclusion seemed small at first. Together, they built a version of you that your soulmate now realizes may never have been fully accurate. That is when they decided something very simple: they were done learning about your heart through someone else. The next truth had to come from you. Stay till the end, because this decision created a moment the third party did not expect. Your soulmate finally responded to the message they had received earlier, but the response was nothing like the conversation pattern that had existed before. They did not mention you. They did not explain what they had discovered. They did not accuse anyone of anything. They simply said they needed some time to think for themselves. That single sentence carried more weight than it appeared to. For the first time, your soulmate was setting a boundary around their own emotional process. No outside analysis. No immediate advice. No endless discussion about what you might be thinking. They needed silence, not the kind of silence that separates people, but the kind that allows a person to finally hear their own mind clearly. The third party replied quickly. Again, the wording was polite. Again, nothing dramatic. But there was one question hidden inside the reply that caught your soulmate's attention. Is this about them? Your soulmate stared at those words longer than they expected. Why was that the first assumption? Why did every change in your soulmate's mood somehow become connected to whether they were thinking about you? Why had the third party been watching that connection so closely? Your soulmate did not answer. Instead, they placed the phone down and felt something almost unfamiliar relief. They did not have to explain themselves. They did not have to provide access to every thought. They were allowed to figure this out privately. That sense of privacy immediately brought you back into their mind. Because once the noise disappeared, what remained was surprisingly simple. They missed talking to you. Not the imagined version of you. Not the dramatic idea of a soulmate connection. You. Your way of phrasing certain things. The way you notice details. The kind of questions you asked. The way a conversation with you could move from something ordinary into something strangely meaningful without either of you planning it. They remembered that they used to feel understood around you before they started feeling observed by everyone else. And that contrast became impossible to ignore. Something important is waiting for you, because your soulmate's next realization was not about the third party at all. It was about their own fear. They had told themselves for a long time that they stayed away because they were respecting your space. Some of that may have been true. But today they admitted another piece. They were afraid that if they reached out directly, they might discover that the connection meant more to them than it meant to you. Listening to other people had protected them from having to face that possibility. If someone else told them you had moved on, they could accept that story without risking a vulnerable question. If someone else said you were better left alone, they could call their silence maturity. But underneath all of that was a person afraid to hear your answer. The strange thing is that recognizing the fear made it smaller. Your soulmate thought, if I can survive not knowing for this long, I can survive an honest answer. That sentence stayed with them. It gave them a kind of courage that did not feel dramatic. It felt steady. Adult. Real. They no longer needed a guaranteed outcome before speaking. They only needed to know that whatever came next would be based on truth rather than assumption. So they opened your message again. The words they had written were still there. There's something I found out today, and I think you deserve to hear it from me. There's something I need to ask you directly. I should have asked you this myself a long time ago. They read the message carefully. Then something about it felt wrong. Too heavy. Too much like they were placing the weight of their discovery onto you before you even had a chance to understand the context. So they started over. This time the message became simpler. I've been thinking about something I misunderstood between us. If you're comfortable, I'd like to ask you about it directly." Your soulmate read that version and felt their shoulders relax. No pressure. No accusation. No promise about what it had to become. Just an invitation to honesty. Their finger moved toward send. Then a strange little memory interrupted them again. It was something the third party had once said months earlier, a phrase so casual that your soulmate had almost forgotten it. "If you talk to them again, everything will start all over." Back then, it sounded like a warning against reopening old emotions. Today, your soulmate heard something else inside it. Why had the idea of the two of you simply talking been framed as something dangerous to avoid? What exactly was supposed to start all over? The feelings? The connection? The possibility that several assumptions might collapse the moment you spoke directly? Your soulmate was careful not to jump to conclusions. Maybe the third party genuinely believed they were protecting them from disappointment. Maybe they thought they were helping. People can interfere without fully understanding the effect they are having. But the result was still the same. Your soulmate had been encouraged to avoid the one thing that could actually provide clarity. A conversation with you. And now, instead of making them afraid, that old phrase did the opposite. It made them curious. What if talking to you did change something? Not because some dramatic destiny was waiting, but because truth tends to change what assumptions cannot. Your soulmate finally pressed send. It was a small action. No dramatic soundtrack. No perfect timing. Just a message moving from one phone to another. Yet immediately afterward, they felt the weight of the day shift. They had done the one thing they had avoided for so long. They had spoken for themselves. Now they had no control over when you would see it, how you would feel, or what you might say. And instead of panicking, your soulmate found themselves strangely calm. They had expected regret. They expected to want to delete the message. They did neither. They simply looked at the screen and thought, "At least this came from me." That mattered. For the first time in a long time, there was nothing between their intention and your understanding except your own response. No messenger. No interpreter. No third voice. Just a direct line. Minutes passed. Your soulmate went back to what they were doing, or at least tried to. They told themselves they would not keep checking the phone. They lasted less than 5 minutes. They looked. Nothing yet. They smiled at themselves, slightly embarrassed by how quickly their composure had disappeared. Then they put the phone face down. The silence that followed became oddly reflective. They started imagining several possible responses from you. A warm one. A cautious one. A simple, "What do you want to ask?" Even no response at all. And here is what surprised them: they realized they could respect all of those possibilities. Your soulmate was finally beginning to understand that caring about someone does not create ownership over their reaction. If you needed time, you deserved time. If you had questions, they would answer them. If you were guarded, they could understand why. That emotional maturity changed the energy of what they were doing. They were not reaching out to pull you back into something. They were reaching out because there was truth between you that deserved a direct conversation. Then the phone vibrated. Your soulmate looked at it immediately. Not you. Another message from the third party. This one was longer. The tone was still careful, but now there was unmistakable curiosity about what your soulmate had discovered and why they suddenly wanted space. Your soulmate read only part of it before deciding not to engage. They did not want the next chapter of your connection to begin inside another conversation about you. So they muted the thread for the evening. That simple choice gave them another feeling they had been missing: control over their own attention. And once again, that attention returned to you. They remembered something else about the last time the two of you spoke honestly. You had not demanded a decision. You had not asked them to promise anything. You had simply wanted clarity. How strange, they thought, that the very thing you asked for was the thing they had been avoiding. Maybe you were never asking for certainty. Maybe you were asking for sincerity. That difference landed deeply. Your soulmate started to understand that some of the pressure they associated with the connection may not have come from you at all. It came from the stories built around it. People asking what it meant. People predicting what would happen. People deciding who should move on and when. The connection itself had become simpler the moment everyone else disappeared from the room. It was two people with unfinished questions. Nothing more needed to be decided tonight. That thought made your soulmate breathe easier. Then the phone lit up again. This time your name appeared. For a second, they did not touch the screen. Their heartbeat jumped, but they deliberately waited. Not because they wanted to play games. Because they wanted to be present. They did not want to open your message while half thinking about the third party or rehearsing what they hoped you would say. They wanted to receive your words exactly as you wrote them. So they took a moment, looked out the window, let the nervousness settle, and then opened the conversation. Your reply was shorter than they expected. No dramatic confession. No accusation. Just a few words. You can ask me. That simplicity affected them more than a paragraph would have. You had not closed the door. You had not pretended nothing happened either. You had given them exactly what they were asking for: space to speak directly. Your soulmate sat there staring at the message, suddenly aware that the moment they had imagined for weeks was now real. They could ask the question. And this time, no one else could answer it for you. They started typing. When we last spoke, you said you were done trying to explain yourself. I thought that meant you were done with me. They stopped. Too vulnerable. They almost deleted it. But then they remembered why they were here. Truth. So they continued. Was I wrong? Their finger hovered. Send. The message disappeared into the conversation. Your soulmate felt exposed in a way they had been avoiding for months, but also lighter. That question contained the real wound beneath everything. Not whether you cared. Not whether someone interfered. Whether your soulmate had misunderstood the moment where everything changed. Your reply did not arrive instantly. Those minutes became the longest part of the day. Your soulmate walked around the room. Picked up a glass of water. Checked the phone. Put it down. Checked again. Then your response appeared. And the first sentence forced them to sit down. You did not say they were completely wrong. You did not say they were completely right. You said something far more meaningful: I wasn't done caring. I was done trying to prove what I meant. Your soulmate read it once. Then again. Then a third time. The entire emotional structure of the past began rearranging itself. Suddenly your silence had context. Your distance had context. The moment they thought was rejection had been something else. You had reached a boundary, not an absence of feeling. And the difference between those two things was enormous. Your soulmate felt regret rise quickly, but they did not let it become self-punishment. They could not change how they understood you then. They could only choose what they did with the truth now. Their next message was immediate. I wish I had asked you instead of assuming. That was the first full admission they had made. No excuses. No mention of the third party yet. Just responsibility. Your reply came more slowly this time. I wish you had too. 4 words. Gentle. Honest. Enough to create both ache and possibility in the same moment. Your soulmate sat with them. Then they realized something else: you had not asked what they discovered today. You were not chasing the drama. You were responding to the real emotional issue beneath it. That made them respect you even more. It also made them rethink how they wanted to explain the third party's involvement. They did not want to turn the conversation into a list of accusations. So instead of telling you everything at once, they wrote, I learned today that some things I was told about you weren't as accurate as I believed. I'm still sorting through it, but I didn't want to keep letting other people speak for you. Your response took longer this time. When it arrived, it contained one sentence that your soulmate did not expect, that explains more than you realize. They stared at it. The words opened another layer entirely. What did you know? What had you noticed? Had you been aware of the third party's involvement before your soulmate was? Had something happened on your side that they had never heard about? The curiosity returned instantly, but now it was different from the anxious curiosity that had controlled them earlier. This was the curiosity of two people finally comparing the same story from opposite sides. Your soulmate asked, What do you mean? Your typing indicator appeared. Disappeared. Appeared again. Then stopped. Nothing came through. Your soulmate waited. A full minute. Then another. Finally, your message arrived. There was one time someone contacted me and said you needed space. I believed them. Your soulmate froze. The third party had never told them that. Not once. And suddenly the distance between you looked completely different again. Because while your soulmate had been told you wanted distance, you had apparently been told the exact same thing about them. Two people waiting. Two people trying to respect what they believed the other person needed. Two people interpreting silence as a choice when silence may have been created by conflicting information. Your soulmate read your message again, feeling the pieces connect with uncomfortable precision. They typed one question, erased it, then typed another. Who contacted you? Your reply came back with a name. And when your soulmate saw it, everything they had discovered earlier today suddenly became part of a much bigger picture because the person who contacted you was not the third party they had been questioning. It was someone else entirely. Someone they trusted. Someone who had always appeared neutral. And for the first time that day, your soulmate realized the interference may not have come from one person acting alone, but from a chain of conversations where everyone thought they were protecting someone from something. Now there was only one question left: who started that chain in the first place?